All right, g'day. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming back to NDC Sydney. Nice to have a local event again. I was trying to find interesting things to talk about, and there's a bunch of stuff I've been doing with data breaches. Many of you are probably a little bit familiar with have I been pwned. Actually, has anyone used this before? Okay, that makes it easy. Who's been in a data breach before? Who's been in Dropbox? LinkedIn? Ashley Madison? There's usually one. There's always a guide. So this is one of the fascinating things about data breaches. You get to see what happens behind the scenes. So as much as Ashley Madison was like a relationship website, that's a very specific kind of relationship, but a relationship website, after the data breach happens and all of the data gets leaked out there on the web and you get to trawl through it and see what happens inside the sausage factory, it turns out that it's not so much a relationship site where guys and girls and whoever else comes along and all meet up. It was a lot of guys and a lot of robots. And we know this because so many of the females signed up from 127.0.0.1, which is kind of telling. So data breaches give us all of these really fascinating insights. And Have I Been Pwned has got hundreds and hundreds of breaches that have gone into it. And now over the course of more than a decade, we just had the 10th anniversary of Have I Been Pwned in December, which is kind of nuts. It's cool that it's actually still in existence, because there were moments there I was like, maybe it won't last. I'm going to give you some examples of that where other services haven't lasted. And even when I did start it, people thought it was going to be a scam. They're like, you're just setting up this massive email address harvesting service because you're going to take the data and then you're going to send me spam, and I don't trust you. I trust LinkedIn and Dropbox and Ashley Madison, but I don't trust you, oddly enough. So it has grown into something very, very large, and it consumes a lot of my time as well. This, when I started it, was a hobby project. I did it in my spare time. I had a few data breaches, and it has become a job. We actually put a lot of effort into it. Charlotte and I, my wife, put a lot of effort into it, and we have a part-time code monkey as well, which is great. So now it's a more serious kind of thing. But it's always kind of funny to explain that to people. And in fact, I think in cybersecurity in general, it's difficult to explain what it is you do. So my wife and I will go out to a barbecue or something, we'll meet new people, and they go, what do you do? We'll go, it's cyber. And they go, oh, okay, cool. But then you have a few beers and Charlotte will say, tell them some of the stories about the data breaches. And every time I told these stories, I'm like, this would be a really good talk. Now, I have a version of this in my head that would be an awesome talk that would immediately get me cancelled, but there's so many really interesting things in it. So maybe this will be a pubcon or something one day. But the one she says I should keep telling people because it's fascinating is the one about the lady with the blindfold and the socks. And I get a lot of emails from people related to data breaches. It's either people who are sending me data breaches, people who've been in data breaches and they don't know what to do. Sometimes the people that are responsible for the data breaches, sometimes law enforcement. It's everything you can imagine. And particularly after the Ashley Madison data breach, there were all of these people who were like, what do I do now? I'm in this thing for various reasons. It wasn't just people out there to have affairs. I'm in this thing. What happens next? I need some help. And I got this email from someone a little while ago, and they said, what would you charge to check email addresses against the cheater website, Adult Friend Finder? Now, Adult Friend Finder was very similar to Ashley Madison, very specific type of friend, and it had had a data breach that exposed about 4 million records just before Ashley Madison, which was in August 2015. The following year, they had a breach that exposed 170 million people. It just never made headlines like Ashley Madison did. So this person wants me to look up their data in a data breach. Now, why would you want me to do this? So they go on and they say, the long story short is I found photos that look like my wife, but the lady's wearing a blindfold. So it's hard for me to ID 110%. Now, my mind did race. It's like, what are the circumstances in which you have found someone who you think is your wife and they have a blindfold on? Now, fortunately, he expanded. He said, I did find matching socks from the images, but that only gets me to maybe 70% and not something like 90-ish uncertainty. They're all very round numbers, aren't they? It's very generalizing. So somehow this guy, now we don't know how he found it. I'm not going to ask him any questions, but he's found this photo of his wife and all he recognises are like her socks and I imagine other attributes he didn't go into, and there's a blindfold and he's trying to establish, is this my wife on this website? And I get email after email of just these bizarre things like this related to data breaches of all different kinds. Now, many of these data breaches get used in different ways. We know Ashley Madison, for example, got used for a lot of extortion. There's a lot of blackmail that got sent to people on the site. Send us some money or we're going to tell all of your friends that you're an adulterer because you were on this website. The data also gets used in sites like this. Now, this was WeLeak Info, and it's a website where you could put in an email address and get a whole bunch of information back about data breaches. Now, I don't know where they got this inspiration from back at the time, but unlike Have I Been Pwned, which just answers that question, have I been pwned? Yes, you have. Here are the data breaches that you were in and that's it. WeLeak Info would come back with all of the data about you. So it would come back with your name, your phone number, your email address. Think about the stuff that wasn't a website like Ashley Madison. And in order to cover their asses, they had terms and conditions that said, you'll only use this to search for yourself. And that was the control. Not our fault if you search for something. We put it there. You tick the box, I agree to the terms and conditions. Anyway, this is what it looks like now, which is good. So it didn't work out real well for WeLeak Info. But they weren't the only one. There's been lots of other similar sites. There was another one that was very notorious, and this was around 2015 to 2017 era. This was Leaked Source. And it was the same sort of deal. Put in an email address, and then here's the data. Except there's one little difference here as well. You might get a little bit of information about the services this person was in, but in order to see the full information, you have to pay money. So now what they're doing is it's like, yes, this person that you're searching for has had all this personal information exposed. If you give us some money, we'll give it to you. But you're only searching for yourself, which kind of makes you wonder, if you're only searching for yourself, why pay money to see your own data about you? Because I already know my gender and my birth date and all of these things. I put it in the website. So these shady websites pop up and they replicate because of the fact that there's just so much data floating around, and then cloud is cheap and it's easy to build stuff and it's easy to get lots of people coming along. They only need a small number of people to give them money and they make a lot of cash. But there's these patterns that you see over and over again on every single one of these services. One of them, very coincidentally, is they all have the word leak in them. WeLeak Info, Leaked Source. I'm going to show you another one in a moment too. And it's almost like that's a red flag. Like if it says leak, you know you're going to be in trouble. The other pattern is they try very, very hard to remain anonymous. Now, if you go to Have I Been Pwned and you go to About, there's my photo there, here's who I am, all my contacts, that's fine because I'm comfortable with what I'm doing. Every one of these services, people try to remain anonymous. And I challenge you to go to any of them. I'm going to show you one that's still live in a moment. Go there and see if you can find information about the person running it. Now, eventually, they obviously do get shut down. I showed you WeLeak Info just before on the FBI takedown page. Eventually, things caught up with the operator of Leaked Source as well. And we learned there was a 26-year-old from Canada called Jordan Bloom. He's this guy here. Now, Jordan got arrested and charged for trading in stolen identity data. He was advertising on hacking forums for people to come and buy other people's data so that they could mount identity theft attacks on the victims. That's why he wanted to be anonymous. And he tried so hard not to be found, except for when he started driving around a bright green Lamborghini. Now, I would argue if you want to be an anonymous cyber criminal, there are better choices of car than a bright green. Look, I don't have a problem with the car, don't get me wrong, but I just think if you're trying to fly under the radar, it's not a great choice. Now, people see things like this and then they look at Have I Been Pwned and they're like, yeah, are you sure you should be doing this? It's like, what if the FBI find you? So that's fine. They've found me already. That's how they gave me this. Like literally a guy came over to my house. I got this. No joke, we went wakeboarding for the day. We had a good time out. They're good people. And I guess the interesting thing here is law enforcement agencies are really, in many ways, fighting a very hard battle to try and get on top of cybercrime, but they are working well with organisations like ever-watchful that are trying to do the right thing. Now, I did this talk at NDC Security in Oslo 1 month ago, and I thought, that was it, this talk is fine. And then this morning, I realised something had happened since then, which I think is really, really interesting, and it highlights all the points I've just made. A couple of weeks ago, I tweeted about the mother of all data breaches. Does anyone see this in the news? It's like the mother of all data breaches. I had so many emails from people saying, have you seen this, the mother of all data breaches? So Bob Diachenko, a security researcher, good bloke, he sent me a bunch of stuff for Have Been Pwned. He's Mayhem Day One. Says he's discovered the mother of all data breaches, like 22 billion records in there. And I tweeted at the time, as soon as I read this, I said, it looks like it's from a Shady breach service, because we've seen a lot of them before. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking WeLeak info, leak source, all the things I've just shown you. And I sort of said, look, collecting all this data and storing it is really trivial. Like, anyone can do this, and then anyone can screw up their permissions and re-leak all of that data over again. Ashley Madison and Dropbox and LinkedIn didn't have a new data breach. Someone's personal stash inevitably just got disclosed. So a couple of days went by, and this service popped up and went, yeah, it was ours. We misconfigured our firewall. Now, what was I just saying about services with the word leak in them, right? Now, you think that's good. It gets even better. And this is why literally an hour ago I was like, I've got to put this in because it's so funny. You see the same patterns over and over and over again on every one of these services. And remember how I was saying, like leak source, WeLeak info, all these ones, they've got these terms and conditions which say you can only use this to search for your own data. Not our fault if you go and use it for illegal purposes. The terms and conditions on this website, I'm going to show you in a second, I have diffed it just one little bit, just diffed one little bit with the terms and conditions from leaked source. Now, in the red on the left was the original one where the founder drove around his green Lamborghini, got picked up, went to jail. Now, this is the new one on the website that is now operating. You kind of feel like they haven't had a lot of legal counsel on it, don't you? You know, like that. I don't know why they made the changes. You may only use this tool, you may use this service. Like, there's these minor changes as if somehow this is going to like save their asses from going to jail. And it's exactly the same thing again. You cannot find any information about the person. You can spend money and you can buy people's passwords and their dates of birth and their home addresses and all these things. And it's just the same pattern going over and over and over again. Later this year or next year or the year after, I'm going to be doing another NDC talk, and I'm going to be going, remember NDC Sydney in 2024? And I said this site, yep, this guy's been picked up in a bright Lamborghini and he's gone to jail too. So it'll be the same thing. It's just fascinating. All right, continuing with unusual data breaches. Fur affinity. Now, does anyone know what a furry is? What? I will be honest, when this data breach happened in 2016, I did not know what a furry is. I look at my kids and they're like, how do you not know what a furry is? I didn't know. There's a little video here that was on National Geographic that gives you a little clip, little explainer.
I'm a 24-year-old adult, and my hobby is dressing up as a blue cat on weekends. I wanted to be able to actually like wear, you know, from head to toe, look exactly like I do sort of in my head.
Courtney is a furry.
Any questions? And, you know, look, this is fine. I didn't know that this was a thing. It is a thing. Now that I know, I'm a lot more aware of it and I've seen more things about it, and so be it. There is a website called Fur Affinity, which is a forum for furries to talk about furry things. There was a data breach. This was the furries at the moment the data breach happened. I'm just loving some of these ChatGPT DALL-E images. I love the way they all look so surprised, but the AI is not yet smart enough to know which way the screen should face because they're all looking at the back of the screen going, whoa. 1.2 million records are exposed in here. So to be just a little bit more serious for a moment, think about this. You've got 1.2 million people who either identify as furries or as part of that community, they've had their email addresses and hash passwords exposed. And when I first saw this, I went, okay, it's people who dress up as blue cats and whatever else. No worries. I'm only interested in the data, email addresses, password hashing. What kind of hashing was it? Was it salted? All of this sort of stuff. I'll just load the data. And the person that sent it to me said, you're going to make this sensitive, right? So what do you mean? Back when Ashley Madison happened, I introduced a flag to indicate that the data was more sensitive than most. So imagine there's like a spectrum, If you've got a Facebook account, are you going to be too upset if other people know you've got a Facebook account? Well, you're one of 2-point-something billion people, not a big thing. If you have an Ashley Madison account, there's a lot of stigma and innuation, all sorts of other things associated with that. So that's something that needs to be more private. You cannot, as a public person, search for someone else and see that they were in that breach. You have to get an email, click the link, and then you can see that you're in that breach. So there's a verification process. There's a whole other story about why we don't do that for everything. So anyway, there's a concept called sensitive. And the person that sent it to me said, you've got to make this sensitive. And it hadn't really occurred to me why, but the next part of this video explains it.
While Courtney feels comfortable in fur, most people would find this behavior bizarre.
Furries can be considered greatly taboo because we look at people dressing up in furry costumes as being child's play, and it's something that should have been left in the past and not brought into adulthood.
And this is sort of the point, right? There is, amongst some, going to be a social stigma about it. So as soon as we get to that point, you elevate into this space of people deserve a greater degree of privacy for some things because it has a greater degree of impact. Now, data like this circulates really, really broadly, not just through websites like Leaked Source and Leaked Info and the other leak, whatever one it is, I've forgotten because there's so many leaked ones nowadays. They also circulate a lot through resources like this. Now, this is a public forum. This is breach forums. It is a clear web forum. You know how you read the news and it's like, oh, there's been a data breach. It's on the dark web. It's all about the dark web. It's very scary on the dark web. Most of it is on public forums that you go to, not through the Onion router, not through a Tor browser, not through anything tricky. You literally go there in Google Chrome and you see things like this. So they run these forums and people exchange data backwards and forwards for various reasons. So a bunch of people will sell the data. So, okay, there's a monetary objective there. They want to make money out of it. A bunch of people just swap it. And I wrote a blog post recently where I talked about this ecosystem. In fact, I was talking about the mother of all data breaches. Just a couple of weeks ago I wrote this. And it just gives you all these examples of where people are just literally collecting data and exchanging it backwards and forwards. And I likened it a little bit to, when you're watching the movies and there's kids in America. We're Australians, so we have a different perspective. But they're like trading baseball cards. Two kids got different baseball cards and they want to swap them because one wants the other one, so they exchange. And the two cards are still two cards, they're just in different owners. This is like that because often someone says, I've got this data breach, you've got that one, let's swap them. Except it's digital, so they just replicate. So now you have two copies of the same thing and then they swap it with someone else and it grows and it grows and it grows and grows. And a lot of the time, it's kids. We know it's kids. In fact, one of the points I made in that data breach exchange blog post a couple of weeks ago was that so often these people get picked up and they're still either legally children or they're kids in the way most of us, because we're older now, look at them and go, 19, 20-year-old kids. They're always very, very young. And they exchange this data backwards and forwards with this sort of reckless abandon. So clear web websites like Breach Forum replicate data extensively. They run for a long time. Because they're on the clear web, you can see exactly where they are. It's easy to track them down. And this was Breach Forums. It was the successor to another service called Raid Forum, which got taken down by the FBI and friends, all the same logos and things over the Raid Forums page these days. Breach Forums, this one, was run by this guy. This is Pom Pom Purin, who decided to use one of these little Hello Kitty avatars. But because he's like every other kid out there with a handful of data breaches and a website, he ends up getting caught. And we learn his true identity. Connor Fitzpatrick, 20 years old. So 20 years old by the time he's caught. So when he started all this, he was a teenager. Not at the end of the teens either, probably somewhere in the middle. And it's really fascinating to see, you've probably all seen this before, you know, the term like keyboard warriors, like everyone who thinks they're anonymous and is out of arm's reach has all this bravado. And they never think they're going to get caught. They think they're so smart. And then they get caught, and then you read the FBI affidavit about how they got caught. Now, one of the things that got this guy caught was when the FBI managed to seize servers, because it's a clear web, it's easy to go and seize them. When they get their hands on it and they're going through all the chat logs, they find that Connor Fitzpatrick is having a discussion with someone else about have I been pwned. I got it in an FBI affidavit. It was really cool. So here's a bit of the discussion. So he's saying, Pom Pom Purin mentioned that Connor Fitzpatrick 02@gmail.com is an email address that he'd searched for and have I been pwned, but wasn't able to locate the stolen AI type database. Now, AI type was a data breach of an Android keyboard. It went into have I been pwned, and this guy wants the data. So he's chatting with someone else saying, I would like this data. You know how I mentioned it exchanges? And this other person has sent in the data, and then he's gone, hang on a second. I can't find Connor Fitzpatrick 02@gmail.com in this data. It's in have I been pwned. It's not in the data you've just sent me. So he's literally doxed himself to someone else in the chat. But the best bit is it goes on, because then he says, in this conversation with Omnipotent, this is the person who provided the data, Pom Pom Purin claimed he did not want to share his actual email for obvious reasons. So he's like, this is not me, Connor Fitzpatrick, because obviously I wouldn't share my own email address with anybody. But he's literally put it there in the chat and the FBI picked him up. And it's stupid stuff like this that gets these people caught, because they've only got to make like one mistake, one little mistake. And if it's not that, so many times it's the VPN dropped. It's like, really? That was your single control. Like the VPN drops, you just exposed your source IP address, and now you're going to jail. So this is what breach forums looks like now. Now, that's not the best bit. The best bit is someone at the FBI in the graphics department is living their best life. And they put tiny little handcuffs on Pom Pom Purin. This is still up there on the Breach Forums website. Now, of course, there is a successor to the Breach Forums website, which now does exactly the same stuff this one did. And someone else is out there having chats with people and exchanging data backwards and forwards and thinking they're invincible. And at NDC 2025, we'll probably be talking about them. So it's the same patterns. Makes you feel old, doesn't it? So I keep seeing the same things over and over again. Another data breach. This one came up just in December, and it's another case of me learning about a whole culture I just didn't know existed. Inflate vids. Anyone know what inflate vids are? Oh, you're all going to learn something today. All right. Their website went down. Now, they said there's no indication the attacker got access to the server itself. Instead, just the instance of the website. You're like, what? So the server's fine, you just got all the data. Okay, gotcha. Sadly, that was enough to pull the database, get access to storage access keys, and delete all the files. So someone has all the data from a website called InflateVids. And again, like I approach this very analytically. It's just data. What happened? What is it? How do I describe it? And have I been pwned? And it was a website about balloons. And in my mind, I'm thinking this. So another DALL-E 3 image. I was like, okay, just give me like a clown with balloons, but the clown's a hacker. And yeah, okay, all right. Anyway, I was thinking it's going to be people who like balloon animals or something like that. Now that's partly right. They call people on this website who love the balloons, they call them looners. Now, what I didn't understand is that what looners are into is balloon fetish videos. Now, does anyone... I'm not even going to ask you. And I couldn't check either because the website was offline, and I don't want to go in and have that in my search history. So I'm trying to figure out, like, what is... Like, I had images. I could speculate. I later learned that, and this was the most appropriate image I can find. I hope this one's okay. But I later learned it's usually like really, really big inflatable animals and the fetish is people jumping on them and deflating them. And again, it's like, all right, I guess, were they hash passwords? Like, let's move on to the important topics here. But this, again, was another entire genre. And of course, this is the sort of thing that you have to flag as sensitive because it could be a stigma, for example, for someone to be in there. So anyway, that went into have I been pwned. It makes it a lot easier for me when the company's already acknowledged it, they've disclosed it publicly. There was something I thought was a little bit interesting, in fact, a couple of things a little bit interesting in their disclosure in the data. And if you look at their message here, they said part of the hack included encrypted password hashes. Now, I'm a bit of a stickler for detail because I think it matters a lot. But when we see data breaches with passwords, they are, and this rounds to 100%, never encrypted. They're always hashed. So, for example, SHA-1, I've made the comment here, SHA-1 hashes. That's not encryption. It is different to encryption. If it's encryption, and so long as you've protected the private key, then you're fine. If it's a SHA-1 hash, then you're screwed, regardless of whether it's salted or not. Like, it's a really, really important distinction because you can calculate SHA-1 hashes really, really quickly and figure out what they actually were. So you can crack hashes at a rate of about, I think, 20 billion plus a second on consumer-grade hardware for SHA-1. So that matters a lot. The distinction matters a lot. 32% always in have I been pwned, already there. So I always tweet the percentage because I'm really fascinated every time I load a data breach, how many victims of that are already victims of other incidents. Now this one, I actually felt was a bit low. So normally I see about 50 to 70%. And at a guess, if you're really into balloon erotica, you're maybe not using your work email address. Now that's not always the case. There's a lot of .gov addresses in Ashley Madison, just saying. Anyway, so that was an interesting breach. Now, speaking of interesting breaches, you know how sometimes you go online and you buy random stuff and you're like, look, I'm just gonna go online and buy some random shit. And normally when you say that, it's a metaphor. Not in this case. This is a real website. It's still up there. Wait until after the talk. .com at the end, it's still there. You can go to shitexpress.com and buy a piece of shit in a box and send it around the world. Like, that is the business model. Just picturing everyone going back to work and the boss is like, so what did you learn? Well, a few things, something about hashing. Now, it's really, really easy to order shit online. Simple 4-step process. Step 1. Choose an animal. Various animals have different types of excrement, different colours, smells, and consistencies. Step 2, you've got to provide an address. We deliver packages to all countries in the world directly to the recipient, National Postal Service. And it got me wondering, because has anyone ever tried to bring like a banana into Australia? How do you bring a box of shit into Australia? And then, like, every time there's one of these data breaches, like, I try to get inside the mind of the person running it, and I'm like, maybe they have affiliates. Like, if it was me, I'd be outsourcing it to local providers because anyway, it just seemed to make more sense. But apparently they deliver everywhere. And then what you do is you pick a sticker, because why not have a sticker on your box of shit before you send it to someone? And finally, and this is where it gets really interesting as related to data breaches, is anonymity. The service is 100% anonymous, will never reveal your identity, even if you pay by credit card or PayPal. And like, immediately, this is a red flag, because have you ever tried to get a credit card and be anonymous? You know, we had things like virtual credit cards for a while, but even those, there's all of these KYC, know your customer things, because of stuff like fraud and terrorism and pedophilia and all the nasty stuff. Like, we need to know who owns the financial transaction. So when I saw that, I did think, this is probably not going to be what they say it is. And as soon as you actually go through the process of ordering your shit and trying to pay for it, you end up at a screen like this, which by my definition is very personally identifiable. This is a Stripe-hosted payment page. We use Stripe for the payments and have I been pwned. And you get a lot of data from the person paying. It's not just the stuff on the screen, the email address, the name, all the card information, but it's things like the IP address that they're on, because that's part of the fraud detection process. So your ability to track down, were you to have all of the data, ability to track down who's actually sent the box of shit to someone else would be very, very high. And I wanted to try and give an example of this. So I was going through the list of all of the shit that was sent to all of the people. And I was trying to find the most interesting things, like what are these people doing? And I found someone who'd gone on this complete shit posting spree. Come on, something, geez. Anyway, this person has sent a lot of messages. Now, does anyone recognize the pattern of the names? Do you know what they are? They're all Supreme Court judges in the US. Can you imagine that? Like, he's had a few beers one night and he's just like, screw these guys, man. I'm going to send them shit. And the best thing is it's anonymous, except for the IP address. That's like next to every single row. This person was very unhappy. And the only reason I realised it was Supreme Court judges is because I recognised Brett Kavanaugh because he'd been in the news because of all the controversy a few years ago. And then I started Googling all the other ones and I was like, wow, this is like literally every one of these people here, these recipients of the shit, it's the sort of people that are going to put you in jail. Like if you're sending something like that to them. I don't think they have a lot of sense of humour in America about stuff like that. So it would be really interesting to know what happened to the person sending this. And the thing is, this data goes into hacking forums like breach forums, which I just showed you before, and it gets exchanged with thousands, probably tens of thousands of different people. Many of the people in those forums are law enforcement agents because this is very, very relevant to their jobs. Now, data breaches like this appear in places like breach forums. People send it to me, and then it goes into have I been pwned. But very often, there are vulnerabilities in systems that haven't yet necessarily been exploited. And people discover these incidents, and often they try to disclose it. And disclosure is a really, really hard problem. So people will get in touch with the company and they'll go, hey, there's a data breach or something or a vulnerability in your system, and they get ignored. And one of the reasons they get ignored is there are so many people that do this over really, really frivolous things to try and get money from what they're asking for as a bug bounty. Now, has anyone ever had one of these? Like you get one of these emails like, hey, we found security vulnerabilities on your website. Shitty, they happen all the time. There's a term for it. It's called beg bounties. So beg bounties, when you get one of these emails, and then it turns out to be something like your SPS record on your DNS is too permissive. Can I have money, please? No, you can't. But because there's so much noise, some of the serious stuff gets missed. Now, someone reached out to me recently with a vulnerability in a service, and they had not been able to get a response. And what generally happens if someone gets in touch with me and they've done all the reasonable things to try and get a response is I send a tweet. And you never want to see a tweet from me with your company name in it like this. Now, this time I knew what it was beforehand. I knew what the service was. And the email that I got from the person that was trying to disclose the vulnerability went into more detail. They said, I contacted you because I reported a serious security issue to one of the biggest gay dating applications, being Grindr, but the vendor keep ignoring me. I sent them all the technical details, but no way. The vulnerability allow an attacker to hijack any account. Now, without even knowing the details, can you imagine on a service like Grindr if you had the ability to hijack any account? Like that's massive. That's really, really serious. And every time there's something like this, you know it's going to be a front page news story. Like you know it's going to get a lot of attention because it's a really serious vulnerability. And I like to try and write really detailed blog posts about things that have happened. We're going to talk about one I wrote last week, which hasn't gone down so well with them. But I like to write a lot of detail because then it sort of puts the facts beyond dispute. I go through, I detail it all, it's in a draft blog, it's private, and then after it's disclosed, after it's fixed, I go and write something. And I'm trying to figure out, like, if you can actually hijack any Grindr account, how am I going to write up a blog post that's impactful, that shows what could actually happen? And what I'm going to need is I'm going to need someone with a Grindr account so that I can demonstrate with their permission the vulnerability. So I reached out to my mate, Scott Helm. And Scott's another security guy, many of you probably know. And we've done a lot of stories like this together, not quite like this, but a lot of similar data breaches stories together. We did a whole bunch of stuff with vulnerabilities in Nissans a few years ago where he actually had one of these vulnerable cars and I could just like turn on his heater and things like this from the other side of the world. So he didn't have an account, but he very generously offered to create one so that I could demonstrate the flaw. So he set up a Grindr account and I just want to be clear, this is a test account. How do you know it's a test account? It says test account, right? Like that's how you know. And the reason I'm making that point is because he got a lot of messages from people that wanted to connect with him. Let's just say that. Wanted to connect with him immediately after. And he's like, I literally wrote test account there. Anyway, so he sets up this account. And I know his email address. So this is one of the keys. You have to know the email address. But of course, you do know many people email addresses. And this is one of the things that fascinates me. People will say, look, my email address is very sensitive, personal. I never give it to anyone. Well, how do you get email? It's like the only way the email address works is you have to give it to other people. And I appreciate that doesn't necessarily mean you want to spray it all over the internet and you get spam. But by definition, it is not sensitive. It is something that you need to provide to other parties. So what you can do is you go over to the login page and then you go over to the password reset feature. Now, we've all done this before, right? Like we've legitimately forgotten our password. You put in an email address, you click the button, and the website comes back and it says, we have now sent you a link. Now, what's in the link, right? There's always some sort of a secret, some sort of a token, something that couldn't be brute force, so that you can then click on that link and it will take you to a page that only you should have access to and you can reset the password. Now, that always includes some sort of a secret token. The problem with Grindr is that when you click that submit button to send the password reset link, if you had your DevTools open and you looked at the response, that's the reset token. So you could take that reset token and you could just put it in a URL like this. And it's really, really easy to establish this because you just go and create an account, you get Scott's photo, you put that on there, you click the link, and then you see that, and here you go. So following that link, you could immediately then go over to reset a new password. So you put in the password, you prove you're not a robot, and it comes back and goes, yep, that's fine. Your password has now been changed. So with that, I could immediately log into Scott's Grindr account. So that would show everything that he would normally see when he's in the account, all of his settings, all of his personal information, and perhaps most damaging, things like all of his personal messages. These are legitimate too. Within single-digit minutes of him creating that profile, he got very, very explicit requests that I can't show you here, but it was fascinating to watch how fast this whole thing happened. And I had never seen anything like that before until last week. And this was the other thing I thought of like just before this talk. You know what I should talk about? Because this was fascinating. Anyone know what Spoutable is? Okay. Whale porn? No. But that's a good note. So everyone knows Twitter and Elon and all the dramas, and a lot of people got very upset because they're like, you know, don't like you, et cetera, et cetera. And they left and they went to platforms like Mastodon and Blue Sky. Spoutable came along as an alternative platform, which is fine. And this is why they say new experience that feels familiar. Now, I had a very new experience with Spoutable just the other day that wasn't familiar at all, other than that Grindr thing. And someone sent me one of these emails again. Now, I wrote about all of this last week. There's a whole blog post about this. And again, like with the Grindr thing, I write really detailed posts with lots of information in so that later on, when someone gets angry, like Spoutable, there's a whole history of exactly what happened and you can't argue your way out of that shit. So someone sent me an email and said, Spoutable is returning a lot of information from an API. Now, we have seen loads and loads of incidents where we have APIs that are enumerable and return lots of personal information. And they're normally enumerable on either the username or the email address. So, for example, Twitter have had issues where they've been enumerable on the email. You put in the email address and then you get all of this other information about the person. Facebook's had a big incident where they're enumerable on the phone number. Phone numbers are great to enumerate because you just keep adding one and you get a different number. And what normally happens is you enumerate one of these publicly facing APIs and you get back things like the username associated to the email address. And then you might get back the profile data and things like this, other information that's shown publicly. And that's what I thought this would be until I clicked the link and I had a look what's in there. Now, because I only prepared this like an hour ago, I've just dumped a bunch of it on the page, but we're going to talk through the highlights. This is my Spoutable account. You could go to great big URL /Troy Hunt, and this is what you'd get. And I glanced at it initially and I went, it doesn't seem so bad. You know, it's got things like my email address. Right, so someone's put my username into a service and it's come back with an email address. All right, that's not great, but that's happened a bit lately. It's got my IP address in there too. That's weird. Why would you return the IP address, and it was my IP address too, why would you return the IP address of the person who signed up in an API? And then I got to this one. And even for me, like I've seen a lot of weird shit, as you've seen, literally. And even for me, I got to this and I went, that is not going to be what it looks like. That's a bcrypt hash. Bcrypt is the way that we would hash our passwords these days. Bcrypt by default has a salt built into it as well, but you can take a bcrypt hash like that. There's lots of websites that allow you to compare a plain text string to a bcrypt hash. So you go to this website, you copy that there, you take my password, and I had set up a password of Spoutable, all lowercase because they let me, and compared it, and that was literally the buzzy sound. I feel like there's enough information on the screen for you to just keep reading while they fix this because it's just fascinating. Okay. Right, let's keep going. So that was the actual password in a bcrypt hash format. And you're looking at that going, wow, that's really bad, but I'm only just warming up because it gets worse than that. They had this. Now, if you've turned on 2FA before, you've probably seen that after you turn it on, you get a backup code so that when you get a new phone and you haven't backed up your Google Authenticator, you have a way of recovering your account. This was the backup code. But you might be looking at it and going, well, it's not such a problem because it's a bcrypt hash, and the bcrypt hash is generally pretty strong. The problem is every one of their backup codes was a 6-digit number. Now, even my kids will know this. How many possible numbers are there if you have 6 digits? You're not my kid, but that's fine. So 1 million, right? So you have 1 million different possibilities. Now, you can calculate very easily tens of thousands of bcrypt hashes a second. So you're looking at, maybe about a minute to figure out what the 2FA recovery code is. So not only do you have the password, if you can crack the hash, and bcrypt is crackable, particularly when you allow weak passwords, but you also have the recovery code for 2FA. But you don't need the recovery code for 2FA because they literally put the 2FA secret in there as well. So you can take this secret, put it in an authenticator app, and immediately generate the code to pass 2FA. But you don't need any of that either because this is there. Now, has anyone who has not read the blog post want to take a guess at what that is? Keeping in mind what we just spoke about with Grindr. It is a hash. It's a SHA-1 hash. What's it for, though? Reset code. This is the reset code for the password. You don't need to crack the password. You don't need to bypass 2FA because you could take that code, you could put it at the end of the URL and immediately reset the password on anyone's account. And in case that wasn't bad enough, when you do that, they never sent an email. So you know how normally when you reset your password on just about any major service, you get an email that goes, hey, you just reset your password. And you go, yeah, I know, that was me. That's fine. I'll just delete it. But if someone else reset your password, you'd be notified. You could do something about it. No reset email. Nowhere to see the currently authenticated sessions either. And if you did change your password, it didn't invalidate existing sessions. So anyone could come and take over your account, reset your password, you wouldn't be told about it, and then if you went and changed your password later on, it wouldn't boot the attacker out and you couldn't see that they were in there to begin with. I often get to the point, or a few of us in this industry, we just go, like it's a good time to be in cybersecurity, you know? It's because there's so much stuff. I was going to say so much stuff like this. This is not, like, this is unprecedented, absolutely unprecedented. But this sort of stuff does happen. They weren't very happy about that. I mean, it's not that obviously they weren't very happy with this, but they were particularly unhappy with the fact that it got reported, which I think is really interesting. If we have some beers later on, if anyone's coming along the cruise, I'll tell you exactly what happened. Now, for the most part, so long as you're not Spoutable, it's getting harder to take over accounts. And the likes of 2FA make it much more difficult for attackers. Not just 2FA, but you get things like, fingerprinting to try and reduce the likelihood of session hijacking. So it used to be that if you could get someone's auth token, usually it's stored in a cookie, you could put that in your browser and then you take over their account. But more and more frequently these days, we tie that auth token to fingerprintable information on the client, everything from the IP address to the user agent to loads and loads of things you could observe that are specific to that particular user on their client to try and reduce fraud. And that's why this service came along. So this is called Genesis Market. And Genesis Market was a service that sold cookies and browser fingerprints. Now here's how it works. You could go along to Genesis Market and browse a catalogue of infected machines. And each infected machine would show you all the different services that the person has logged on to. Now, it does this because if you have malware on your machine that can access the browser and it can access the cookies, it knows where you're authenticated to. It can also access that browser fingerprint, so it can see that you're using this version of Chrome or this version of Windows. And here are all the different attributes that might then go into whatever token is meant to tie the cookie to the client. So they created a marketplace that has not just the cookie, but all of the other material necessary to make the browser behave like the victim. And then they sold that data. This was normally $59, bargain at only $41.30. Because if you paid your $41.30, you could get access to their Dropbox, the Apple Store, the Gumtree, all of the other things here. And this is how the marketplace worked. Now, because they're very customer service orientated, they also had some other features as well. I appreciate it's a bit small on the screen for the folks at the back, but one of the things they said here is Genesis team take care about your comfort, which is important. And that's why they have the plugin. So what the plugin would do is it would trick your browser into emulating all the fingerprintable attributes of the victim. So suddenly it doesn't matter that you're on the current version of Chrome because it's behaving like Firefox on a Mac, because that's what the victim used. So when they sold access to these services, it was a total turnkey solution. You go in there as an unsophisticated buyer of personal identity data and you start clicking around with the browser plugin and you're just like the victim. This is one of the folks that ran that service. Didn't work out well for a bunch of them. This was earlier last year. So there was a massive law enforcement exercise with, I keep saying the FBI and friends. A lot of these agencies, for those who don't know, things like the AFP here, obviously, FBI, the NCSC in the UK, or the NCA in the UK, the Dutch in particular are very involved in these things. They all collaborate together. And they took down this service and they made something like 120 arrests immediately. And that's not just people running the service, but it's people buying data from the service as well. And since that time, there's been a whole lot more arrests as well. Because think about all of the information you collect on people. And to go back to things like the whole Shit Express kind of thing, you leave fingerprints everywhere. And at one point, you've left the fingerprint that ties your email address to your IP address. And it might just take a while before a data breach turns up and it's got that information in it. So this is what the website looks like now. And again, we get all the logos and everything there. They decided to call it Operation Cookie Monster because they were selling the cookies. And again, we go back to the FBI and the art department. And they've got this FBI agent there with full hoodie, looking at the screen, with the hacker in the hoodie looking backwards, which I thought was a nice touch. But like the best bit about this whole thing, in fact, there's two best things. Number one is have I been pwned gets a mention, which is nice. So they gave all the data to have I been pwned so people could search for themselves. But the other thing that I thought was really, really nice, Operation Cookie Monster, on the desk, the FBI put a cookie being munched by the FBI agent. And again, I would like to think it's that same person who put the little pom-pom prune in handcuffs in the earlier takedown notice. Okay, look, I am leaving time for questions. So first of all, thank you for coming and watching this. I hope it's been interesting. I know it's a little bit different to the normal dev talks. We've got about 10 minutes. Does anyone have questions? So the question was, is it illegal to keep the data in your local system? That's a good question. Does anyone else have a question? Sorry. So the general response to that is you need to form your own conclusions. It's a very legal question, and there are certain controls and things that we do to try and mitigate that. We've had loads and loads of legal advice. We spent way too much money on a combination of lawyers and accountants. Form your own opinion. I would point to lots of very high-profile precedents, and what I mean by that is that there are lots of tech companies, for example, that will use this data to try and identify things like password reuse. Amazon's a good example. Amazon has got a long history of sending people emails saying, look, your Amazon account is fine, but your email address and password have just appeared in another data breach. And I think part of the way they cover their asses with that is they never tell you the data breach. And I've got all these emails from people where they're like, hey, Amazon just told me I'm in a data breach, but they won't tell me which one. Do you know which one it is? It's like, no, maybe stop reusing your passwords. That would be a good start. So seek your own legal advice. Other questions? Down the back. I think you got a microphone there too, mate.
Yep. Even the small application nowadays, they use Azure B2C. So the control is totally out of your application to Azure services. So you are safe. So why these big companies, they still keep passwords, hashed passwords to their application where they can steal, people can steal data?
So is the question, why do big companies keep hashed passwords, or why do they keep
like even small application, we use Azure B2C, we don't have to deal with all these identities, right? We only have email address. We don't deal with passwords, even reset passwords sent by Microsoft services.
So are you then saying you're using services where authentication is delegated to another provider?
Yes, like Microsoft B2C.
Yep. And you know, if it was me building a system, I would not want to sit on passwords. I would be very happy to delegate it to another provider, delegate it to Azure Active Directory Services, or there's lots of other authentication providers out there as well. I think to answer your question specifically, many organizations are very worried about delegating authentication to another party because they lose direct control of it. But then they create the risk that we just saw. And there's a whole other discussion around maybe we should just use passkeys and things like that and have a different set of problems. But I think that is honestly the answer. Many organizations don't want to lose control. But if it was me, I'd be using a different provider for sure. More questions? Yeah.
You probably can't answer this, but where do you get your data from?
These
breaches?
No, I can definitely answer that. Some of it literally from the FBI. So the Genesis Market stuff, they sent that. We've written about that. The FBI has a pipeline where they feed compromised passwords down into, there's a service in Have I Been Pwned called Pwned Passwords. So they feed passwords that they've come across in the course of their investigations into that service. And then you guys can all go and freely query an anonymous API that allows you to see if a password's been in breach before. We're up to about 8 billion queries a month on that now. So it comes from there. It comes from the likes of the forums, breach forums I just showed you. Very often data's posted there. Most of the time, it's someone who gets in touch with me and says, yeah, hey, Troy, look, I've found this data. Would you like it to have I been pwned? Sometimes it's the person responsible for the breach. So then I'm like, oh, you really shouldn't have done that. But okay, now that it's out there, and we got to have that awkward discussion. Look, it comes from many, many different places. It's rarely me going and looking for it anymore. I mean, for the first probably 6 data breaches in Have I Been Pwned, I did that, and then people support the project. Maybe different. Yeah? Yeah, good question. So first of all, you're right. Legal advice is very expensive. And then how's it funded? So initially, it was just all out of my pocket. So when I started this, I was living in Sydney and I had a normal corporate job, but I didn't have any legal advice on anything, and I just paid pennies for Azure cloud stuff. Over time, the things that you'll see that have changed and have been pwned, 1Password has product placement on the front page, so they pay to have product placement. I think it's a really good place to have that because that's kind of the most relevant point to go and get a password manager. I wrote many years ago about some organisations, such as identity theft companies, have access to data to be able to provide that data to their customers. So if you sign up for some identity theft providers and say, look, I want to know if something happens that puts my identity at risk, they'll hit have I been pwned and they'll go, okay, here it is. You'll also see on have I been pwned as of 2019, we started to put a small fee on API access, largely to tackle abuse, which it did beautifully. And then over time, we've just added multiple tiers so you can have greater levels of queries. And then in August last year, we put a charge on large domains if you want to do domain searches. Mostly because when we looked at where all our overhead was, most of it was because of like Fortune 500 companies hitting API searches of domains for free. I'm like, oh, you probably should pay some money. So that well and truly covers things like legal advice. And it's kind of self-perpetuating because as soon as you start charging money for service, then you have to get the advice to go and do that as well. You had another question? Yeah. So effectively, the question just asked was around enumeration vectors on websites. So if you go to log on to a website and you put in an email address and a password and the email address doesn't exist, normally it says, hey, a combination of the two doesn't work. If you go to password reset, very often there's a vector there and the vector will say, this account doesn't exist or we've sent you an email. Some sites try to get around that and they say, if the email address exists, then we'll send an email to that address, which I don't like because if you don't send it when it's a real email address, but you didn't actually use it on the site and you never get an email, you're just sitting there going, where's my damn email? Like did it go to spam or something? But your question was around registration. So how do you deal with this when you go to register? Because you can't have two accounts with the same email address in the system. And the answer is very simple. You have to give the same response whether the email address exists or not. So the response you give is, thank you for registering. We've sent you an email with further instructions. And then there's two different types of email. One of them is, click here to verify that you actually wanted to sign up. And the other one is, you've already signed up. It's actually really, really easy to avoid that. It's a question down the back.
How long before you have to shut this down, right? So when are we all going to grow up, start using passkeys or whatever better technology is where this whole have I been pawned is no longer relevant? Do you have a prediction? Is it going to be here for 20 years? Is it?
To answer it with a question, who has less passwords today than they did 10 years ago? You're lying. Who thinks they'll have less in 10 years from now than what they do today? You're wrong. And the reason why I say that is because I literally remember doing this on stage like a decade ago. And of course, this has come true. It's because the old passwords don't die. Things like passkeys are great. They're giving us alternatives. For anyone with elderly parents, have you tried explaining passkeys? Like it's about as much fun as trying to explain 2FA and then try to support them after they haven't backed up their Google Authenticator. We have better paradigms coming along. We have so many better technical solutions for passwords than passwords. The thing that keeps passwords alive that nothing else can beat is that everybody knows how to use them. And if you're building a service and you have to try and make it as accessible as possible to the masses of all sorts of different levels of technical capacity, having a username and a password is the easiest way to get people in through the door. And it keeps us in business. So on that note, I think we're at time. I've got a whole bunch of stickers and 3D print logos and things. If you want some, please come and grab them. And thank you very much for coming. Thanks, folks.